you, Dr. Fritz, for sharing the video. And we have much to discuss here. I think at this point, I'll turn it to Professor Longmire.
Great.
And are we going to give the introduction now? Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mina, Dr. Bose. And thanks again to all of you for being here to talk about what is obviously an urgent situation that's gone on for decades. Again, we're so grateful to our guest, who I hopefully is here soon, and because he's been raising these issues, speaking truth to power about the potential omnicide of the species. Some of you may have read Jonathan Schell's important works where he talks about potential omnicide, the death of everything, the death of all. And of course, this is a call that he's been, that Daniel Ellsberg has been sounding for so many decades. I'm hoping all of you have seen the post, because again, these are not issues that go away. These are issues that continue to really threaten the life of our species as we grapple with this historical moment. And so I'll just, again, so many of you, and I think the film so well demonstrated this journey. I'm thinking what we might do is bring in some of our faculty and talk a little bit about their reactions to this film and to this issue before we welcome Daniel Ellsberg, who I believe will be here soon. He's in Berkeley, and hopefully the technical problems, which some of you experienced yesterday, I think, when Facebook and WhatsApp was down, hopefully those will be resolved. But again, it's so important as we look at this kind of mess of a world that we find ourselves in. It's so important to try to understand the kind of work that he's done. Some people have called him the most dangerous man in the world. And for others, he is, of course, the most heroic of whistleblowers, trying to raise questions about what we are doing. You could argue for many that he is the ultimate patriot, taking risks in order to question the democracy in which we live. But in any case, we are dealing with right now this kind of moment of multiple compounded crises. So the kind of insight that he provides us with is not only important to understand, but it's also important to inspire us to try to, if it's not too late, do something about these patterns that we are all grappling with. I always like the word kairos, a time when change might be possible, a moment in which problems have become obvious, requiring that we face them. And that we have to assess, are we in such a moment? Is change possible? Is this crises or these compounded crises we face, is this an opportunity, hopefully, for fundamental, profound change in our foreign policy, in our lives in general? And clearly, sometimes there are people who are able to step into this kind of historical moment of compounded crises, and actually, because of who knows what combination of courage and clarity and conscience, are able to make history change, or at least be a kind of leader in raising questions that can lead to fundamental change. Clearly, Daniel Ellsberg was and is one of those kinds of persons who, recognizing the historical moment, is able to, again, speak truth to power. It's been 50 years he's been doing this, as we look back at 1971, and who helped to not only end the war in Vietnam, not only bring down a corrupt president, but also provide the kind of moral model that enables us to really make that kind of fundamental change. And again, this book is so important because it continues that kind of work. He had also smuggled out, leaked the papers that deal with US nuclear policy, hoping to, and now finally, distill those for all of us. And so it's really a continuation of some of the revelations of the Pentagon Papers. And this is, of course, it's a very frightening look at the kind of policies, the kind of planning that has gone on from inside the Doomsday Machine that he talks about as a former military analyst and planner. He certainly knows from both the inside and the outside what the stakes are, what the dilemma is. And so it's, for me, he kind of models and I think for many of us, the kind of Gramscian notion that we have to think pessimistically or critically or realistically, but we have to act with optimism and inspiration, hoping that it is not too late, hoping that it is not too late to, again, speak truth to power, but also to turn around some of these policies. Just if you'll forgive me a quick personal anecdote. Some of you know I was born and raised in North Dakota. And, for a long time, and still there are some, North Dakota out there in the Great Plains, it's remote, minimal population, had this huge stockpile of weapons, primarily ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, pointed right over the globe at the USSR. And of course, the grim joke in North Dakota, which some of you know, was that if North Dakota, little remote North Dakota, ever seceded from the US, it would be the third most powerful country in the world. And despite the humor, the grim humor of that, it's important to understand how and why our nuclear policy is so destructive. It certainly didn't make me feel safer. It certainly is hardly the kind of power that we would want as we look down the road at the history of our species. And it certainly it's not real security and perhaps even not real sanity. So it's Daniel Ellsberg who has really been this kind of voice for change, for profound change, and who's embodied the kind of courage to make that change. So we are so grateful that he is here. We hope that he is here. But until then, I would like to ask my colleague from the Political Science Department, Paul Fritz, whose specialty is really this kind of policy, to join the conversation, and then other colleagues as well. Dr. Fritz?
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Longmire. Thank you for that introduction to what Dr. Ellsberg has done over the years, because it is critical, it is important. His book, The Doomsday Machine, is well regarded in the sense that it's historically accurate. His research is deep, his personal experience with this is fascinating. And I think that interview actually gets to some really critical issues. The system we've built around nuclear weapons is incredibly and almost unimaginably deadly by design for perceived needs of deterrence, but things can spin out of control quickly. In that short video clip that you watched, Dr. Ellsberg talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the time in history where we've come closest to nuclear annihilation. But there are other cases that we could talk about, other near misses, the 1983 Able Archer military exercise that the Soviets thought was a ploy to invade the Soviet Union and would have resulted in an all-out nuclear strike. The episode in the Soviet Union with a radar malfunction where one lonely colonel saw the threat board light up, and that indicated an all-out nuclear attack by the United States, and his decision to not send that information up to the leadership likely prevented a nuclear strike by the Soviets in retaliation for what they thought was a nuclear strike, but mistakenly thought it was. So the system that's been built up that Dr. Ellsberg talks about, there's a logic to it. There's a of deterrence that's associated with this, but it's a pretty deadly logic. It is a bet, essentially, that individuals would be rational enough to not be so silly, be so dumb as to launch a strike on their own, because they know that anything would end up in what's called mutually assured destruction, or MAD as it's known. This is the situation the world has been in largely since the 1960s, and finding a way out of it has been extraordinarily difficult. And this is where the point, I think, of Dr. Ellsberg is important, that it's the system that we built up around that is going to be a challenge to change. Yes, it may need to be changed. There might be real reasons to move this. We've seen multiple efforts to do this. The Global Zero movement, for example, has put forward a powerful argument for why there needs to be global nuclear disarmament, and it lays out how to do this in stages. Yet we've seen the United States and other nuclear powers resist these calls to implement any of these ideas for stated reasons of security, that it would put the United States in a precarious security position. This is the same logic that the United States, France, Great Britain, the UK, China, and Russia have used to not ratify the treaty banning nuclear weapons, that the nuclear weapons provide deterrence and a type of security that in the world today would be foolish to get rid of, and create really problematic dynamics going forward. So in this sense, right, Dr. Ellsberg's work is identifying all of these problems and all of these, and also highlights the reasons that we haven't seen more progress in eliminating the so-called Doomsday Machine. But we could go further and talk about the reasons that the United States, Russia, China, and others continue to modernize their nuclear weapons forces in the face of all of this, in the face of what Dr. Longmire called the insanity of nuclear weapons. So it's a timely issue, and it's always a timely issue because of the extent of the threat. This may not get put in your face on news programs and newspapers every single day, but we're living under the specter of nuclear warfare constantly. And I think Dr. Ellsberg's contribution is really laying this out there, and forcing us to think about things that could potentially change this. So, you know, for those reasons, I hope that he's able to attend so that we can hear directly from the man himself. So.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fritz. I'm wondering if we can bring in, while we await, hopefully, you know, there's several theories about, obviously we understand technical difficulties and Zoom problems, particularly after yesterday, but also, you know, perhaps I don't want to aid any conspiracy theories, but perhaps his participation is being blocked. We don't know. We don't understand exactly the situation. But one idea would be to do some breakout rooms and discuss a little bit amongst ourselves what we think about this historical moment we find ourselves in. You know, I think for a long time people thought, oh, you know, their nuclear threat is just on the back burner because of this, again, so many diverse threats, the pandemic, of course, the crisis of democracy, of course. I think on some level there, we are all probably overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenges we're facing historically right now. So one possibility would be to do some quick 10 minutes in the breakout rooms, getting a read on what people think about this historical moment. You know, we kind of live in a culture of denial. And I think for so many, when we feel overwhelmed, we tend to just opt out. And I know particularly that must be the case for the young folks among us who feel just making their way through life can be a challenge. So I think, Professor, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I would have emailed you, but since we're in real time, I think I usually love breakout rooms, but since we only have about an hour left, I'm a little concerned because we know Mr. Ellsberg is trying to access the Zoom right now. So we want to be able to bring him in as soon as he can. I'm just wondering if maybe we could continue a discussion. There's actually, picking up on your very helpful commentary and Dr. Fritz's commentary on the fear of nuclear war, the possibility, the times we came close during the Cold War, and subsequently, there's actually a former Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration published an op-ed today, William Perry, saying that one person, the president, shouldn't control the nuclear button. And it's a really, I think, an interesting topic that we could lead, and we have our colleagues in the audience as well if they would like to join in this. So maybe we could have a discussion and then maybe open it up for student questions or audience questions, excuse me. But former Secretary Perry says that a decision to launch nuclear forces requires serious deliberation, appropriate consultation. We should reject a policy that gives the president the sole authority to launch nuclear forces. Now, this debate assumes that, right, that nuclear weapons will remain. And I understand that Professor Ellsberg was planning to raise a different question about the Doomsday Machine. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about institutions and decision-making in democracies, particularly in the United States, about the use of nuclear weapons. So I'm just wondering if I know you've done a lot of work in this area, and just given your own experiences growing up in North Dakota, seeing, right, experiencing the real risk, right, that was there. If you'd like to comment on that, and maybe Professor Fritz and Professor Melkonian as well.
Even better, growing up in North Dakota does not an expert make, but I appreciate it. It certainly makes an expert in, marginalization in some respects. But I see that our distinguished colleague, Professor DiNincenzo, has his hand up and would probably like to comment on that whole question. And it's such an important one that you raised, Dr. Bose, about is this the best protocol, concentrating this much power in the hands of one person? Mike, would you like to comment? I saw your hand up. You're on mute, however, Mike. We can't hear. We would like to hear.
Okay, thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes. Great to see
you,
Professor Dillon.
I see it. So thank you, Linda. And Mina, thank you for your wonderful introduction, identifying all the great groups at Hofstra that are involved, including your center. I was so glad that you cited in your earlier comments Jonathan Schell, because certainly his work is to be related to the tremendous work that Daniel Ellsberg has done. And a lot of it was contemporaneous. And in case folks are not aware of this, Schell wrote a three-piece series in the New Yorker in early 1982, and very unusual for the New Yorker to print that kind of series. And then that was made into his book, The Fate of the Earth. But out of that 1982 series in the New Yorker, as many of you will know, came the biggest peace demonstration in American history. More than 1 million people assembled in Central Park, including many Hofstra people. And it kind of goes to Ellsberg's point and others about the power of the president to make decisions about nuclear weapons. And just very briefly on this, some of you will recall that Reagan and Weinberger had said, we must be prepared to fight and win a protracted nuclear war in 1981. I don't think Reagan wanted to fight a nuclear war, but of course he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And then people began saying, can you win a nuclear war? How long is a protracted war? And Daniel Ellsberg and Schell have done a lot about showing what access, each nation can hit the other nation with intercontinental ballistic missiles in 30 minutes. And then in submarines, you get within 10 minutes or so, but the submarine launch ballistic missiles. So the efforts of Schell And Ellsberg launched, very encouragingly, I think, major protest movements to try to limit what any president, Democrat or Republican, could do to initiate a nuclear conflict. And I've just add one last point on this that we're very proud of. At Hofstra, thanks to Marty's initiatives earlier, we formed a chapter called UCAN, United Campuses to Prevent Nuclear War. And there are 600 chapters around the country. And Marty, with his great organizing skill, got Hofstra to be the center of those chapters. And I became the national director of United Campuses to Prevent Nuclear War. And what a job our students did, helping Physicians for Social Responsibility, international physicians, and contributing to the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And last night, for those of you who watched New York's Peace Action, Robert Schaefer, the son of Don Schaefer, who helped out in so much of this, was announced in the Schaefer Foundation, still giving the awards for peace action leaders that Hofstra's chapter received in 2019. I'm looking forward to a revival of our peace action chapter so we can continue to play that active role.
Great, great. Thank you, Mike. I think we can see some of the pieces coming into focus. As Dr. Bose mentioned, we need to really examine the nature of the presidential structure. Is this too much power for one human being to have? And then Mike brings in the very important need for pressure from below, civic engagement, activism that would also help to make foreign policy in this urgent area more transformative, more democratic, and perhaps and hopefully wiser in the process. And I think we can start to see these various pieces that are necessary. But again, I think we need to stress this is a transformative moment, hopefully. This is a moment where perhaps the compounded crises we're dealing with open opportunities for substantive change, not just a change of regime, not just cosmetic change, but a structural change, as we are dealing with on so many fronts here in our challenged democracy. Let's open things up. Marty Melkonian, Professor Melkonian. You're muted, Marty, you're muted. You need to turn on the mic. And please, others, join in what I think is a very important discussion. Marty, can you hear us? Can we
Let me
hear
just
you?
say, Dr. Longmire, while Professor Melkonian's unmuting, I've turned off the chat for now so that we can have this conversation. And then I believe that people can still send chats to the panelists. So that would be to me or to you or Professor Melkonian or Professor Fritz. So if there are questions for us, please direct them and we are happy to take those.
Let me also invite Professor Eisenberg, who is with us, I believe, or perhaps not. Marty, go ahead, but you're still muted, I believe. Marty, we can't hear you. We can't hear you yet, Marty. You need to unmute. You need to unmute. We can't hear you. While we're waiting for that, anyone else who would like to join the discussion to talk about, again, the urgency of this revisited nuclear crisis. And Marty, are you with us?
I think I'm unmuted, thanks. What I was going to say is that I'm wondering why Ellsberg felt it necessary to write this book, considering the fact that since the end of the Cold War, 1990 or 1991, we've dramatically reduced the number of nuclear weapons in the world. Certainly the United States and the Soviet Union have dramatically cut back from 50 or 60,000 to closer to 10,000. So that seems to be a positive sign. But at the same time, there is a growing danger. And one of the reasons, I think, is the fact that the new nuclear weapons that are being devised and prepared and built are likely to be more usable than the ones that previously existed. And perhaps you can fill me in on this, Paul, that the weapons tend to be smaller and used in actually conventional war. So there's a sense that maybe we can use these weapons if we get entangled in a war, and that it might not mean the destruction of the whole world because of it. But I think the point that Ellsberg is bringing out is that once you begin a war, even to use smaller tactical nuclear weapons that might have a fraction of the really big ones in terms of their explosive power, once you begin to use them, the other side is likely to do so. And before you know it, huge exchange will occur. And not only will it mean destruction of people and facilities, but the oncoming of the nuclear winter that he writes about in this book.
Paul, would you like to address that?
Yeah, absolutely, because this is relevant to both what Dr. Bose was talking about earlier in terms of authority, but also what Dr. Ellsberg is writing about and what he actually did as a it's a continuation of the logic from the 1950s on, where this idea that nuclear weapons, for some, as early as 1946, were seen as fundamentally unusable. Bernard Brodie wrote a book called The Absolute Weapon, and made this case that the only purpose for nuclear weapons was deterrence from here on, and they could not be used. And the job of the military was to, from that point forward, to avoid war. Well, nobody was really satisfied with that within the military establishment. The presidents went back and forth on this issue. And what came out of this, in a sense, was as nuclear weapons got bigger and bigger and bigger, and arsenals got bigger as well, there was always this pushback on how to use nuclear weapons and to fight and win a nuclear war. What the doctrine was called, so what it eventually was called, was counterforce. Using nuclear weapons to attack the nuclear weapons of your enemy, hoping that this would send a signal to your enemy that if they retaliated, you would then target their cities and kill millions of people. The problems with counterforce are legion and well known, and every president eventually rejected because it's unworkable. As Dr. Ellsberg notes in his book and talked about in this video, a counterforce strategy that the US military planned still included several thousand nuclear weapons. This is a recurring theme in US nuclear strategy. This goes in the, as I said, started in the 1950s, was revived in the 1970s. Professor Malkonian talked about Reagan, who embraced this notion of nuclear war fighting and winning a nuclear war, protracted nuclear war. But the story was, until the 90s, was always the same, that it doesn't make sense, you can't do this, nuclear weapons are just too big, they're too powerful. This is when we get the movement to what Professor Malkonian talks about, the smaller nuclear weapons, in terms of reliance on these in terms of war fighting. They've always been around. Small nuclear weapons have always been around in terms of tactical nuclear weapons. But what the US military has been planning now is so-called dial-a-yield weapons, where there's one weapon and you can have a really big explosion or a very small explosion. And you can match these with highly precise delivery systems. Our ICBMs, our precision-guided missiles and other things are extraordinarily precise at this point in time, within a meter, half a meter of accuracy, hitting their target. So you get this combination of really precise weapons, really precise delivery systems, small nuclear weapons that seem to be usable, that make them more usable, because we're not talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're talking about small levels of destruction against largely military targets rather than civilian targets. But the same problem that we saw in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s emerges. How does that target distinguish between a small, limited nuclear strike, which is still big, and an all-out attack? And the issue is they may not. The issue may also be that they may feel that they have to respond in kind. So the escalation dynamics of nuclear warfare remain. according to a lot of scholars who look into this. And I think that is one of the reasons that Dr. Ellsberg felt this imperative to write this book and to bring this issue about, because yes, we've seen dramatic reductions in the number of nuclear weapons, but advancements in other areas have potentially made them more usable, at least in the minds of some policymakers. And I'd like to link this back to what Dr. Bose mentioned too. In the US, that means that it's up to the president who makes this decision solely in whether to use these. I have not seen Secretary Perry's op-ed with this, but this is a common theme, and this is something that others in Congress have also talked about. And this is a fundamental issue for the United States, and it has been for a while. During the Cold War, for example, I mean, there are the reasons that we have this structure and authority where one person is the sole ability to launch a nuclear strike, is the fear that the Soviets would launch a surprise attack and we need to respond almost instantaneously. As was mentioned earlier, you have about 30 minutes before an ICBM launched from the Soviet Union or Russia reaches the United States. So you have to have a structure that can respond to this. Traditionally, if we think about the way the use of force is supposed to work in the United States, Congress makes choices on war. Congress cannot be counted on to make a decision within 30 minutes when we're talking about nuclear war. So we saw this devolution of, or this evolution of authority into the president for this sole authority to launch strikes, which has had other effects too. And we've seen sort of this transformation of Congress abrogating their authority on other uses of force too, not just the nuclear field, but it's maybe the most dramatic. And that's where we are sort of in this situation now, where whether it's a Democrat or Republican, the only person in the United States that can legally launch nuclear weapons is the president. Cutting out any deliberation with other bodies, other branches of government, not requiring so much as a cabinet meeting or any other consultation with leaders that the president has around them. And there's been a growing call to change this. I think the Trump presidency probably increased these calls because Trump very cavalierly spoke about nuclear weapons and nuclear war. But this has been an argument for a long period of time across different administrations that this authority was potentially dangerous. So much so that we have a number of instances, you know, in the late period of the Nixon White House, as he was facing impeachment. We have this famous episode where James Schlesinger, his Secretary of Defense, told everybody in the White House, essentially, if Nixon reaches for the big red button to launch a nuclear strike, to contact him first. Dramatically, we have the situation with Trump in regarding China and General Milley's actions, recent actions, where General Milley reached out to China to try to reassure them that the US was not preparing for a strike because he feared that President Trump, who has the authority, would launch some sort of preemptive strike against China. Any sort of preemptive strike against China would eventually involve nuclear weapons. This one is maybe morally correct in some ways, according to a lot of people, but raises some really tricky issues. General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is not in the chain of command when it comes to a decision for a nuclear strike. He potentially inserted himself here in a way that would not necessarily be legal. That highlights the need to review these policies, where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff would have no role necessarily in a nuclear strike, where it would simply go from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders, bypassing large parts of the authority structure that we would normally see. So I know that was a little bit long-winded, and I feel like I fit in like all of or half of my class on nuclear weapons there, but they're really important issues. And I think they're actually linked together really well and highlight the dangers that we're facing, that the world has faced for a while regarding nuclear weapons.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to, oh, sorry. just say, I think it wasn't long at all. It was incredibly instructive to bring together, right, the substance of nuclear deterrence and the institutional actors that make the decisions. And I actually have a follow-up, Dr. Fritz, and let me just say, it looks like, unfortunately, at this point, our speaker is not going to be joining us. They've been trying, but there are some technological problems. So we will, not to worry, we have Professors Longmire, Mahoney, and Fritz and I will discuss. We will, and I think we'll maybe talk for another 15 minutes and then open up for audience questions. Because I think there is one, Professor Fritz, as you were speaking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think about from the 1962 to 2021 and how much expectations for institutions have changed. Because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy learned about the missiles in Cuba 90 miles from Florida on, I believe it was October 16th, it was Tuesday morning. Did not inform the public, though by that point had several meetings with his executive committee before October 22nd. But that is when he informed the public. Today, and at the time, that was largely accepted, that the president should be able to inform, consult with, but not necessarily seek approval from, certainly not from Congress, and to inform the public that the power, the two presidencies thesis, foreign policy, the president is the leading, is the primary leader. More recently, as you brought up during the Nixon administration, this imbalance of power was brought into question, especially in other areas of foreign and military policy as well. And then most recently, the new Woodward book that raises questions about what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs may have done and with what authority to communicate to China about that the United States would not be using nuclear weapons. Professor Fritz, would you just want to comment quickly on that? And I think I see Professor Malkonian that I think our speaker is joining us, if I'm correct. Yeah, okay. Is Marty, you have to unmute again. Marty, you have to unmute again. There you are. Oh, nope, you muted again. There you are.
Okay, Dr. Ellsberg has been contacted. He'll be coming on very shortly. And Carol, would you please let him into the Zoom?
Yeah, we'll do that. So then let me just ask if, thank you, Marty. Professor Fritz, could I just ask you to respond on this question of how the debate over the balance of power has shifted from this kind of expectation that the president's decision is in the public interest to kind of the active debate today about who should be involved in that decision-making process, and then I think we'll turn to Professor Ellsberg after you.
Certainly. So I mean, it's a fascinating question. It's a really important issue. I think with the end of the war, there was a little bit more of a recognition that we don't have this high alert that is necessary, like we did during the Cold War, during the highest tensions of the Cold War. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, was accepted as presidential authority there, whether it should have been is another question, but it was largely because of the structure of international politics and the need to be able to respond so quickly. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the demise of this immediate overwhelming threat, I think you started to see more questioning of whether this is the situation that we need now. Now, 9/11 sort of, I think, briefly brought this back to full presidential authority over all matters of national security, but nuclear weapons are not relevant to terrorism in terms of deterring terrorism and responding to terrorism in other sorts of ways. So I think there's been a sustained push in the post-Cold War era with a few blips here and there to start rethinking this. That said, there's been no movement at all. There's been no change that we're aware of in terms of actual policy. Members of Congress have put forward different ideas, but there hasn't been any substantial policy change that we know. Even the little policy change that Barack Obama introduced in his administration's nuclear posture review to talk about just this idea of not introducing nuclear weapons into a conflict with a non-nuclear weapon state was reversed by the Trump administration in the 2018 nuclear posture review. So it's an important debate. It's important. I think it's good that it's coming back up, but we've not seen any real movement yet in terms of policy.
Apparently also part of the reason that it is resurfacing goes back to the release of these documents that he has been distilling and working on, but apparently were lost. So this book has been a kind of, again, an expression of his ongoing urgent concern, taken from his notes in that same period. Again, I think pointing to the fact that there are these critical moments where people are of great conscience and great courage, able to not only speak truth to power, but hopefully pry open power in ways that will allow for a wiser, more just, and more sane policy. And of course, that is that historical contribution that that Daniel Ellsberg has made to all of us. And again, I would argue it's not only about nuclear policy. It's about the whole, as we pointed out, the decision-making structure. It's really, the stakes are even bigger than that, though I'm not sure if you can have bigger stakes than potential nuclear annihilation. But again, I think he's contributed so very much to democracy and the survival of democracy. What is it that we need to know as citizens? What is it that power needs to hear from citizens? And so again, I think an incomparable contribution to our understanding of the American political system, but of course to survival of the planet as well.
He's here.
Longmire, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe that Mr. Ellsberg has joined us. And so without further ado, I would like to just welcome him. And I think he is currently muted, but I think he is on the Zoom. Mr. Ellsberg, let me just say, Dr. Ellsberg, let me say what a pleasure it is to have you here. I'm going to turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Professor Linda Longmire, to give the formal welcome. Please, please.
Welcome again to our conversation. Sorry for any technical delays and problems, but you as an expert on technical delays and problems of the nuclear sort, we are so grateful that you're here to join us. We know people have talked about you as the most dangerous man in America. We think of you as one of the most heroic in the world. And so we're so grateful. We've been discussing your book. We've been discussing some of the big issues facing all of us as citizens today as we look at potential omnicide, so many compounded crises that we're dealing with. And we hope that this is a kind of moment where crisis does become opportunity. But we are so profoundly grateful that you're here and for the 50 years of extraordinary work that you've done to try to speak truth to power. So we look forward to hearing what you would like to share with us today. We've been focusing on your current book, the new book, the 2017 book. But again, welcome back to Hofstra University. We know you were here before, and we're so grateful for your work and for your being in this troubled planet. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Well, obviously, I couldn't be more mortified. This is what comes of dealing with Nightyrolls. I'm sorry to say, something is in my hand. Oh, I looked back and actually I had it not only in my calendar at 12:45 or 1 o'clock, but then I looked in my earlier messages, and I am mortified to see that a number of them did say EST. And of course, I wrote it down wrongly. I'm going to take a minute here because it's in my head. When I was, because of the occasion, the time difference here, when I was in Vietnam with the embassy in 1965 to 67, there was a Westmoreland, whenever the Viet Cong would pull off some spectacular attack, some stunt of some kind that had not been foreseen at all, Westmoreland would put out the commander-in-chief of the Military Advisory Command would put out a message saying, yesterday, in an act of desperation, the Viet Cong did this or that, blew up the embassy or did something. And there were so many of those that I made a chart of AOD for acts of desperation. And one of the best of them was that on their national day, which people did, I'm talking about events before you were born, but we've been reproducing them so regularly now in Afghanistan and other places that you have lived through it in your own way in a different part of the world. But their national day, I have to say, was the day that the leader we had assigned to them, the Catholic dictator No Dinh Diem, was assassinated. And that was their national day. While we were there, supposedly fighting with them, they were celebrating the fact that they had assassinated the person that we had kept in power there for a dozen years before that. But anyway, on their national day, they always had a big review, a parade in front of a reviewing stand in front of the National Palace. And the president, so-called president from totally rigged elections, elections is that Donald Trump would appreciate entirely. All the people we elected there were totally rigged. In the case of No Dinh Diem, for example, in his first election, he got 102% of the vote in the Saigon area. More people voting for him than were registered voters. And actually, my former boss, Ed Lansdale, had said to Diem, he was his advisor, Mr. President, you don't need to win by 100%. 60% is really more than adequate, but that wasn't sufficient for him. So 90, 100%. So on this particular national day, there was an AOD. Namely, the Viet Cong had put 4 missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, which are what they call line of sight missiles, meaning that they don't go up like an artillery shell in an elliptical thing, but they have to go straight to the target, more or less. They use them instead as artillery, which is almost impossible to do accurately. They aimed them up in the air, and they landed these 4 warheads right in front of the reviewing stand, in front of the president, all together in a cluster. It was an unbelievable feat. An act of desperation, as Westmoreland said, except that it was an hour before the parade actually took place, and there was nobody there because the Viet Cong were on Hanoi time, it turned out, for their messages with Hanoi, which was an hour different. So on this particular case, their act of desperation didn't achieve anything. Okay, with that introduction, we're looking at a technical situation here in which we have, as I was reminded just yesterday in a piece I'm writing that will come out in The Nation tomorrow on the reason we should get rid of our intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are, by the way, on a ballistic path, unlike line of sight. They do go up and they come down. And in 5 different states, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Colorado, and Nebraska, there are people sitting, lieutenants sitting in very deep silos, launch control centers, practicing every day the drill that they should follow within 4 minutes of receiving a message that they are to launch their intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they can get that done within 4 minutes. The covers of these missiles the concrete covers are being rolled off up above. They're in the cornfields somewhere. You can hardly see it from the surface. And these missiles will come out, and 30 minutes later will land in the Soviet Union or China or elsewhere. And they have been there. These Minuteman missiles have been there essentially since the early 60s. In fact, the first group of them was, well, it's like what just happened here or the Viet Cong. They were jerry-rigged They're supposed to have a lot of, at least 2 different launch centers have to go simultaneously to launch them as a safety measure. But they didn't have time for that, to rig them in time for the crisis. So they got it so that just 1 center could do it. And back in 1962 for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so if they get this message, which will reflect in most cases, what they're prepared for is reflect a warning signal that has come from our tactical warning systems that enemy missiles are on the way. Ideally, these can actually be detected from satellites that will detect the infrared, the hot plumes from the missiles actually rising in Russia. So you get them right when they take off, 30 minutes from impact. But if they don't get those, or they miss those somehow, hold on, let me turn off my another technical thing here. Turn off my machine. Yeah, right. Hi, Julia. I'm at Hofstra University. I have to turn this off. Hold on. Okay. Sorry. You'll see the relevance of this in a way. These little technical problems. Yeah. Okay. Now. Okay, so they will detect the plumes. If they don't do that, other satellites will detect them or something else as they come through the stratosphere. And finally, ground radars will detect them as they come in, more or less. And you have these more or less reinforcing indications then that an attack is on the way, or that something is on the way. In the past, these signals have been sent through, this sounds hard to believe, but it's true, with high flying geese over Canada, for example. And nowadays, I think with so many countries having not so many ICBMs, but missiles for space exploration and for satellites that they're putting up. So nowadays we have every day many indications at first that a missile has gone up somewhere. They have to track it. Where is it coming from? Where is it coming to, and so forth. So they're kept busy all the time trying to weed out actual attack from a supposed attack or something that might be an attack. Thank you.
Pretty hot there. Be careful.
Okay. Now, it so happens I was in the Pentagon in 1960. We're talking a long time ago, right? Talking to a very old person here. So I was in the Pentagon when the BMEWS system, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, BMEWS, was turned on, which are very powerful radars in Canada and Alaska, Greenland, elsewhere, that were to, before the infrared satellites, before almost any satellites, they were to pick up these signals that were coming from incoming planes or missiles. The BMEWS was for missiles. Earlier, it was just planes. And as I say, the planes did pick up geese and other things as well. So they were to turn it on, and the the executive officers of IBM, Intercontinental Business Machines, which, by the way, was the initial name for intercontinental ballistic missiles. But IBM got a little antsy at having these missiles called IBMs. So they changed the name to ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Same idea, though. So the president of IBM is there at NORAD headquarters, North American Air Defense Command, to witness, cut the tape and so forth, that they're turning on this system, which is going to give us warning of an incoming attack. And a lot of other, a lot of Hewlett, the predecessor to Hewlett Packard, and other, a lot of CEOs were there for this great event, which had cost a lot of money. In other words, a lot of profit on this thing. And as they're watching, a signal comes through that an ICBM is on its way, as they've just done this in 1960. And then, so bells are going off, whistles, red lights, everybody's scrambling to their desks to follow this and so forth. And 2 or 3 are on the way, and the businessmen, this actually happened exactly like this. And the businessmen are hustled into an adjoining room for some reason. They're not supposed to watch the process, not clear why they couldn't just sit there and watch it, but they're pulled in and they're waiting. And finally, 20, 30, 40 missiles, more than we believe they had at that time, are on the way. And well, 30 minutes pass, nothing explodes, fortunately. And it turned out that what had happened was that the radars were catching the rising of the moon. They were bouncing off the moon and coming back, indicating a missile attack. Well, they actually had known that the radars were strong enough to reach the moon, but they hadn't realized that the signal would be strong enough coming back to be interpreted as a rising, as a missile attack. So we didn't preempt. In those days, we had hardly any missiles. Let's see, in 1960, in 61, we had 40 ICBMs, Atlas and Titan. In 60, I'm not sure that we had any, but we had many, many planes, thousands altogether, including tactical planes, ready to go off on this warning to get up above the ground, get out of the ground zero area and go on to Russia to attack. And as I say, in this case, they didn't have to, they didn't go because 30 minutes went by. The planes now were, all ready to go. Some of them were in the air, command planes were in the air to go. That was the initiation of the immune system 60 years ago. Well, coming right up to much closer to the present, come back in 1995, President Yeltsin in Russia actually has the command computer, little laptop computer with everything on it, brought to him. This is the contents of what they call the football in the president, that's always with the president, so he can initiate an attack at any time, wherever he is. Guy shadows him outside the bedroom. And Yeltsin got this, actually, that a missile was on its way to Moscow, and he had minutes to decide. And Yeltsin, of course, a famously alcoholic. Unfortunately, this was in mid-morning, not in the middle of the night. So he had time to think about it a little bit. But anyway, he was dallying. He was not going right away to respond as he was supposed to do, actually. And they finally figured out that the missile was not on its way to Moscow, or it would have exploded by that time. It was coming in from the North Sea. That turned out to be a weather satellite, that missile they were sending up, rather, to study the northern lights, basically, from Norway. And it had been notified to the Russians that they were sending this off, but it hadn't gotten to the right Defense Department area, and so it was registering as an incoming missile. This was in 1995. Now remember, this is well after the Cold War is over. However you figure that, 1990, 1991, Berlin Wall went down in 1989. So there's no reason to think whatever that Russia would be doing this. How about just sending one missile? Does that make sense that they would send one missile? Yes, because both sides have planned as their ace in the hole of, quote, decapitating the other, hitting its command and control, in this case, Moscow, in a way that gives them their only chance, as they often say in top secret stuff, of coming out essentially scot-free in an attack, because they have paralyzed the other side's ability to respond. They haven't hit the missiles, but they've hit the command. The only trouble being that on each side, to prevent the possibility of their forces being paralyzed by a single attack, which might be a terrorist attack on the city, a single missile or something, or an accident, it's assured that each side will not be paralyzed by that, and will get in the Russian case, they developed something they called the dead hand system, or perimeter is its code name, but the dead hand is evocative of what actually happens. If Moscow goes out of communication, if Moscow is destroyed, or for whatever reason, its communications are totally out, in the original design of this, a missile would be sent off from Moscow outside Moscow. There would be sensors that would reveal by electronic and radar and radiological means that Moscow was no longer there. So these sensors would result in firing off a missile over the missile fields, which is broadcasting the go code. Go. If Moscow goes, they all go at pre-designed, pre-planned targets. And they particularly put that in when the Carter administration in its late days, under the National Security Advisor Brzezinski, made a point publicly of the fact that we were targeting their command and control, decapitation. Why they would announce this, I've never figured out. It doesn't make any sense why you'd tell the opponent that you're planning to do this, but he did do it, and as a result, they went into crash mode to develop this dead hand. And in some forms of the dead hand, it's not totally automatic. The missiles, the signals go out to a ring of launch control centers outside Moscow, well outside, and people there decide whether it's a real thing or not, and they're supposed to go. These are colonels who rehearse all the time going, as we do on our side, comparably. So you do have a human in the process, but almost certain to respond by sending the missiles off, as they've practiced so often. And Putin has actually announced publicly in speeches that they have revamped the dead hand system. They made a point of it. They have revamped the system. And there is a point here to saying you can't decapitate us. If I may review here for a moment, telling the other side you mean to decapitate us doesn't make any sense that I can reveal. But once you have revealed that, it does make sense to tell the other side you will not stop us. We had that system back in the late 50s, at a time when, for decades, the president, the White House said repeatedly, no one but the president can authorize or send off, can actually send off a launch. Don't worry about it. No rogue person, as in Dr. Strangelove. Well, by the way, let me just see, how many people here have seen Dr. Strangelove? Is that seen by people? Can I see your hands? Yeah, well, not everybody.
Used to assign it.
As I said to people later, publicly, Dr. Strangelove was essentially a documentary, slightly dramatized, but the people were recognized, their types, what they would say, what they would do. Everything in the movie that occurs had its counterpart in real life. For example, one thing that was very esoteric, I knew it as a student of the command and control system, who at that point, as far as I know, was as knowledgeable about it as anyone, certainly as any civilian outside, and was aware of the odd fact that once you set off these planes, then before missiles, they had 6 hours or more to go before they reached their targets, in some cases much more than that. So once they got an authenticated signal that this is the president or this is somebody, and I'm telling you to go, that's a second message, there was no stop signal. There was no way for anyone to authenticate the fact that with authority, they were telling you to come back or to stop. That was a very big secret, which I revealed. I discovered it in the Pacific. I revealed to various people at the time. And again, that would seem strange. Why would you have an arrangement like that? And the answer was, the official answer was, well, if there was a stop signal, the Russians might get the code. And then in the event, they would be able to tell you to stop, and they would paralyze you if you got that. The real reason as a number of colonels and brigadier generals told me at the time, was, look, they didn't trust the president to carry on during these hours of blowing up the world and not get cold feet, or perhaps Khrushchev at that time, or another Russian, would convince him, don't do this. This is bad. We're all going to die. Don't do it. Carry it back. So they didn't trust the president not to screw everything up by deciding at the last minute to call them back. So they wanted to make it possible, if you've gotten this go code out of the president, twisted his arm and haven't gotten it, he can't reverse it. Okay, that remained true. In many respects, that still remains true, although not entirely, but it was true for a long time. Now, as I say, in those days, the White House was out of communications with Hawaii, where CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, was, and CINCPAC in turn was out of communication with what they called WestPAC. Sorry for all the acronyms, but that's Pentagon speak. Part of every day. It's before satellites, so they had cables. Fishermen would cut the cables from time to time. Things would go wrong. They were out of communication for hours every day. And so, to prevent being paralyzed in that event, in case there were an incoming attack, as I say, the president had authorized lower commanders, theater commanders, in the Pacific, in Europe, and elsewhere, to go on their own initiative if they were out of communication with Washington, or for some other reason, the president was unavailable. Eisenhower had 2 attacks. He had a heart attack and a stroke at various times that put him out. And of course, Reagan was shot, got a shot. And again, this is before your time, very much yesterday from my point of view, but General Haig, famously announced, "I'm in command," which was not true, but there was a lot of confusion at the time as to who would control it. And we've just had the experience right now, as every time there is a change in presidential command, we are told that the president's football and the allegiance of the person who is guarding that, who's controlling that with the president, switches from the president, the former president, to the new president at the moment of inauguration, a dramatic event that symbolizes that the ultimate control of life on Earth has been transferred from one man, so far they're all still men, to another man. All of which, by the way, is just announced recently. In this particular case, Trump wasn't at the inauguration. He's in a plane on his way when the commander shifts. And they mentioned that because they were so afraid that this has just come out in these books that are just coming out this week, that because Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did not trust the president's stability or sanity or whatnot, or was afraid that in order somehow to postpone his being out of office, he would launch an attack. And the Speaker of the House, now the 3rd person in succession after the vice president, if they get killed, Pelosi, was discussing with the chairman their joint belief that, quote, the president was crazy, quote, and might launch an attack out of the world, ending, most civilization. They believed that was a real possibility. That's the world we're living in right now. Were they wrong? Well, they had circumstantial evidence on their side, but, not proof. But we are in a world where these people believe that it was possible that the world would be blown up for these personal, crazy, but not crazy to want to stay in office in a way, just use of presidential powers. Okay, so it seems that the football did not accompany Trump on Air Force One as he goes back to Miami, even though for a couple of hours in the air, he was still commander-in-chief. So he was separated for an hour. Why did that happen? That's never happened before. Why did that? Well, because the chairman of the Joint Chiefs didn't want him to use those 2 hours badly. So the world is depending on that sort of thing. Okay. What I'm leading up to saying is that's all a charade. The launch of our weapons does not depend on the president making that decision, precisely because, as I've said, he might be shot by Hinckley, who just got out of prison, was he not? He was just paroled after all these years from shooting Reagan, or Washington has been hit, something else. So those codes do not reside with the president exclusively. In fact, and I could send you a very good article by Bruce Blair, who's the major expert on this. You can look him up on the web. He doesn't have the codes for launching at all. All he has are codes that identify him as the president. The launch codes are not only in the Joint Control Center in the Pentagon, but of course they're also elsewhere. They more or less have to be, because the Pentagon would be destroyed in the same launch as the president. How many people have the ability to send what appear to be authorized launches? I don't think anybody probably knows how many. I knew that was not true. In the late 50s, I was the expert on this. I briefed George Bundy, the assistant to the president for national security. I briefed him on that. He was not aware of all this in January of 1961. And at that time, nobody knew exactly how many people could do this. And that's probably true to a considerable extent today. But the key thing is more than one, more than two, more than five. A lot, actually a lot. And when it comes to unauthorized, that's an authorized thing. Unauthorized, an enormous number of people. For example, I was reading in Bruce Blair's article just the other day, locks did not go on the submarines, so that they had to have what amounted to a combination lock code sent in before they could fire their missiles until 1997. Now, that's 7 years after the Cold War has ended. Have any of you in hand seen Crimson Tide, the movie Crimson Tide, or was that before your time? See, one person, Denzel Washington. Very dramatic film over the question on a submarine of the commander, Hackett, wants to fire the missiles, and his second in command, Denzel Washington, doesn't. They go back and forth, and there's a mutiny. And the end of it is an announcement that the Navy, once it announced, this could not happen. They couldn't fire that just on the submarine alone because there were locks on this. That was untrue. I'd have to look back and see exactly what year did Crimson Tide come out, but it was a lot before 1997, long before that. The Navy was just lying on that point.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we're closing in on our class time. So we're going to give you the last word to wrap up, and then we thank you. This has really been so instructive. I'm sorry, it's just that the students will have to go to their next class in a moment.
Are there any that would, first of all, I would be happy to, this was all stuff I hadn't even planned to say, but it is relevant. If anybody can stay because they don't have a next class, is that true of anybody? I'd be glad to continue here. And second, to do the whole thing at any time. It's totally my fault. Can I have, or not? Is that not, neither of those possible?
I think there are people who would want to stay. There's people from the public, and so perhaps we could continue for another 15 minutes. Is that okay, everyone?
I think
continue for what? Yeah, for a little bit. Okay.
We will. Some people might have to depart.
For those who have to leave, do they have 3 minutes or not?
Yes, I think we can keep 3 minutes.
Let's see what I can say.
Thank you, Dr.
Building on this, there are no circumstances imaginable in the world in which the security of the United States would be improved or anything but destroyed by firing one of those missiles under any circumstances. if there is an incoming attack, and I've been rambling along here, but I could give you many other examples with Carter and others, where they have been told falsely that there was an incoming attack, and they were right on the verge of ordering a response. These are actual instances. In not one case would it be worthwhile for the US or anything but catastrophic to respond at all. If you hit Soviet ICBMs that are still in their silos and have not been sent for some reason, because most of them will be on the way, that will have no effect on the world for the ensuing nuclear exchange, because they're submarines, which we can't destroy. We can get some of them, but we can't get all of them. Their submarines are more than enough to destroy United States civilization and evince a this US response itself would lead to nuclear winter. In other words, as a solution for the security problem, if one side launches an attack, for the other to respond with a nuclear attack, which is taken for granted, virtually not challenged by anyone, that will have exactly the same efficacy for anything as using bleach against COVID or oxychloroquine. It is a totally deadly remedy that you're using. So we have, in my last 2 minutes, in other words, we have a totally insane system here ready to go on minutes. It is the most elaborate and prepared and expensive scientific system in the history of the world, which amounts to a doomsday machine, to a decision in the event of certain false signals of ending civilization, probably not total extinction, because some people would survive on mollusks and fish on the shores of New Zealand or Australia, despite nuclear winter, which is caused by the smoke from burning cities in the stratosphere that will cut off most sunlight, kill all harvests, and starve nearly everyone. So it's not extinction. It's a question of killing about 90% to 99% of the people in the world in something which, the threat of which has various effects, some good, of deterring a war, but at the cost of preparing in the event of certain misjudgments of a kind that happen all the time, like, if I may say grandiosely here, like my little mistake at the beginning here, a misjudgment of when this was supposed to start and so forth. That wasn't going to end life on Earth. But the president, who is as human as Donald Trump, at least in every case, has this bill. We're all prepared to do it. There is no rationale for having this capability in existence except for the money that is involved in paying Northrop Grumman to build these new ICBMs and the others, and also assuring our allies that they should give us the benefits of being their protector by offering this supposed protection. And we get various benefits economically from this protection racket, from this scheme, which, whatever benefits it has, are at risks that are absolutely unjustifiable. So I'm saying the article is coming out tomorrow in Nation for me with Norman Solomon simply makes the point, there is a way actually to reduce the risk in the world very, very markedly, not to zero, anytime. And that is by dismantling our ICBMs, not building new ones, which we're about to do, which we will do, about 100%, which we will do. But rather than that, getting rid of our ICBMs so that there is no launch on warning. There is no question of responding with an insane action to evidence of an attack on either side. And if the US did that, the only thing keeping us from doing that is an ICBM caucus in Congress, which consists precisely, for strategic reasons, 10 senators who understand alone of the 100 that you must have ICBMs for strategic reasons, which by coincidence happen to be the 10 senators in which missile bases provide local jobs. And instead of finding other jobs and other income for Wyoming, North Dakota, Montana, no, we have to keep on alert, 10-minute alert, this doomsday machine, this ability to destroy life on Earth. Obviously, a situation that is insane and immoral, and in some sense could quickly be changed, even, but is unlikely to be because of our political economic system here. Okay, well, I've gone on that. There's a lot. There's everything to say other than that, but the events of the last month, where we're learning about Milley and Pelosi and their concern about this situation, mean that this is something we're living with literally today, not this year, not this, today, right now. So it's up to all of us to try to warn people actually of something they're not anxious to hear.
And we are so very grateful that you are and have been for 50 years sounding that warning and that alarm, because it may be one of the things that keeps us from omnicide or a version of it. And so we are so very grateful. Wish that we could chat further, but we're really grateful for all of the work you've done for the last 50
I repeat, for anybody who can right now, I'm here to let me know how that works. And any other time, I'll do it. And you can be sure you have me any amount you want, any hours that you want in this. I'm happy to do it. But I've just told you what I've had to live with for 60 years in terms of knowledge. So how could I do otherwise than to try to do what I can?
Great. Why don't we say that if there are people that can stay, as Dr. Bose mentioned, the next class cycle is coming up, but I know there are other people who might want to stay and have some questions and a chance to hear more from all of this accumulated experience and accumulated conscience and courage. I know I'm thrilled because, as I mentioned before, I was born and raised in North Dakota, so I grew up with the silos and the boom and bust economy and all of the consequences that come from being, I mentioned the grim joke, if North Dakota seceded from the Union, it would be the third most powerful country in the world, we used to say. But the reality was and continues to be grim, with ICBMs pointed towards our destruction, perhaps as a whole species. So we're so grateful. And again, all of you who can stay for another 5 minutes, feel free to, but students, we think you've gotten the glimpse of the stakes, the importance, and also the courage of Daniel Ellsberg. So thank you so much. Anybody who would like to stay, any other questions?
Doctor, let me just say thank you, Dr. Longmire and Dr. Ellsberg, for this very instructive talk. I'm sorry that I have to run, but hopefully others will get to ask questions and hope to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, colleagues. Yes, a question. I noticed we've been joined by our own Carolyn Eisenberg. Dr. Eisenberg, do you have a question or comment you'd want to share? You're on mute, I think. I think you're on mute, Carolyn. Rusty? Rusty, I think you're still on mute. We can't hear you.
I'm back.
There we go.
I can hear you. We can hear
Now we
you.
can hear you.
Okay. I guess the question that I would like, and I may have missed some of this, is it's really the question of how likely is it that we can get effective organizing to take place, particularly about the land-based missiles, which, for most people, they hear like land-based missiles or ICBM and like immediately asleep. Oh yeah, well, that's something. I don't know what it is. And I'm thinking of it particularly in the context of all of the anxiety about climate change, right? Which is something when people were organizing around nuclear weapons, 40 years ago, climate change wasn't really on the horizon, but now there's like multiple serious dangers to life that's on the horizon. And so I keep thinking about these, this even within the defense budget, the authorization bill just passed, which is paying for more of these, right? That's the plan. How is it possible to really get people to pay attention to this, given all the things that are going wrong? I know it's not a very cheerful question, but.
Not a very cheerful topic, but thank you. Yes, please, Dr.
You want me to answer or go on? Yeah, yes, okay. Very, very difficult at this time. We're not seeing it. There was a time in the early 80s, and that's 40 years ago, but less than half my life, when people were informed, knowledgeable about the dangers that were involved, and actually they had been scared by the president, Ronald Reagan, who appeared to be very complacent, to say the least, about the dangers of nuclear war. He joked on an open microphone, which he thought was dead, by saying, we've declared war on communism. The bombing begins in 5 minutes. A joke, which was noticed in Moscow. That, this is the way the president is thinking to lighten the mood, or something, to make jokes on this subject. But and I have to say one other thing about that situation. It was a time when the president then, or the general secretary of the Communist Party in Russia, Andropov, believed that the US president was crazy. Partly because of comments like this and evil empire he was going to discuss, and actions he was actually taking of penetrating Russian airspace on reconnaissance in various ways, very provocative ways. He thought he was crazy and was actually preparing for a first strike. In that mood, he had a very high alert to give him warning if this was actually taking place, what he expected. And he actually even had a time for it. He thought that an exercise that was scheduled for November 1983, codenamed Able Archer, was going to be cover for an actual surprise attack. It was going to imitate an American attack, but he thought it would be cover for the fact that it really was an attack that was going on. So he was ready to respond. Now, some of the things I've just been saying are really quite unusual perspectives on this situation, because I don't think you will hear anyone else that I know of actually raising the simple question, what use would he make of that warning that would help Russia? Suppose there was an attack on the way. Was there anything he could do in a military way that would improve the results of that? In the light of nuclear winter, which was discovered by coincidence that year, 1983, it wouldn't make any difference who went first or second, or whether he responded or didn't respond. There was no use Andropov could make of that warning, which was the most elaborate intelligence network set up for warning ever in the world. But what use was it going to be? It could do one thing, which was on either side, not entirely without significance. It could tell the president on either side to get out of town, very simply, to get into a warning plane, get away. That's the only thing, if that matters, that you could actually do in response that would make any difference. So here is he ready then to respond, where the response would be of no use whatever in 83. Now, we now learn this month from the Woodward and Costa book that, as I was saying earlier, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Speaker of the House were convinced that the president was crazy, not their president, our president on this side was crazy, and might actually launch a surprise attack, as in 83, 40 years ago. And they had more reason. Well, it was like both sides had reason to think that. Reagan was not planning a surprise attack. For all we know, Trump had no thought of such a thing. We don't know the contrary. That might have been a delusion. But was it an unreasonable belief? No, obviously not. They had They were not crazy to worry about this. So we had a situation where it was reasonable to worry that he might actually do this. In '83, that roused a huge mass movement. The movement for a bilateral nuclear weapons freeze. Neither side would produce any more nuclear weapons, strongly opposed by the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, and the president, and so forth, though actually accepted by the Russians. Brezhnev agreed with the freeze. And there was it was a mutual thing, obviously. It wasn't something he could do unilaterally. Well, he could have said no more, and that would have been the right thing for him to do. But he didn't do that. But he did say, if we agree, no more. He also said no first use at that time. And that stayed for years until, in the lack of any reciprocation by the US, they abandoned that. So they do not have a no first use. Only China and India have that now. Okay, so we got a movement, huge. Town meetings all over the country supported the freeze. It was on polls, there was something like 87% support for the freeze. Now, you've all followed polls, but I don't know if you thought that you don't get 87% of the people telling you they know the name of the vice president. I mean, you don't get 87% for anything to speak of. Maybe the name of the president, you can get it. So this is amazing support. And we were all, of course, very encouraged by it. So you then did have, in short, you did have a real movement. It's hard to say that it had any effect on anything, on Reagan or the others, although it did encourage them with Gorbachev to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Weapons Treaty, which actually destroyed a whole class of nuclear weapons. The only agreement that actually did that, where there was inspection of actual destruction of weapons. And indeed, the weapons they destroyed, few people would appreciate this fully, were the most dangerous weapons in the world at that point, even more than the ICBMs. The Pershing II, stationed in Germany, our Pershing II, could reach Moscow in 6 minutes, not 30 minutes. So it didn't give them any time for alerting or anything. Now, what I've been saying was, the second level, that didn't really make any difference one or the other. Hardly anything makes any real difference here. But in terms of their worries that they could be decapitated by this, and that the reason we were putting it in November of '83 was to support, enhance this first strike, they feared. And that was a very rational inference. Why else did you want a Pershing II like that, unless you were going to make a strike? Well, the answer is because it's money for the corporations who make it. That's the beginning and the end. That's it. But if you say beyond profit, what difference make? No, you can't find anything. So it encourages the belief then that we're preparing for a first strike. The situation, in other words, is almost entirely the same as it is right now. And we just abandoned the Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile Treaty, which Putin promptly joined. Now, he didn't have to join that. He could say, no, we're still observing it. You're out of it. That would be more rational from a human point of view. But then Putin had never been in favor of that from the beginning. And a lot of his their Pentagon, their military-industrial complex, never wanted that treaty. So as soon as Trump, but they didn't abandon it right away. There was reason to say they were violating it to some extent, but that could have been handled without changing the treaty. As the usual process. If there's a suspicion that one side is violating, you go through inspection, you go through negotiation and so forth. You didn't have to abandon the treaty. But the fact that he did abandon it right after showed that the problem is not only entirely on our side. They have a military-industrial complex too, which now has, remember, exactly the same incentives that ours does. They make money from these things too. They have a capitalist system. They have the equivalent of their Northrop Grumman. that's on this. So they're part of the problem. And what we don't have is a movement. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's so many other things pressing on us. Unquestionably, climate is a slightly different problem, but it's not possible to say that one, meaningfully, that one is more serious than the other. They're both, the highest level of meaning, of risk and danger. They're a little different, on a different time scale. But you have that coming at us, and we're not dealing with that, although that is the major subject. And for that, you have a good deal of a movement, except for the fact that the pandemic, of course, kept Greta Thunberg out of the streets until this month. She was marching now this month in Munich, this last week, and back, but you didn't see what she was saying earlier. You had, under thanks to Greta's encouragement, 15 million people, young people, nearly all young people, on a Friday off from school, marching against this climate, on the climate issue in your scope, to no effect that anyone could see. No one is better at recognizing this than Greta, who said who I had the honor of meeting when she was still on a rather small vigil in front of the parliament there in Moscow, and Patricia and I joined her, I'm sorry, in Sweden rather, and Patricia and I joined her on a frozen morning. And it was a year after that she had millions of people in the street. But what effect? As she said yesterday, I saw her, you can all see her, on the Democracy Now! I think it was. Democracy Now! Greta Thunberg saying, they make these promises to us as though they're listening to us. She said, but they're not listening to us. They're not having any effect. She said, it's blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. She said this a dozen times. She said, the test is whether the emissions are going down. The test is not whether we're putting people in the streets. That's not success. Success is measured by emissions going down, and they're going up. It was yesterday, I said, it's now the UN are saying that on current rates, emissions will be 16% up in 2030 compared to 2010, instead of where they're supposed to be cut in half. 45 to 50% are supposed to be down. Instead, they'll be up. So there is a question, do even movements make any effect? And it's hard to point, but you can see some effect, as in the intermediate range. It's very hard, in short, to get a movement with the pandemic, with the other things that Black Lives Matter, again, enormous importance. And there you did get a movement.
Josh, can you mute your mic?
Wait, one last question. We all know what Black Lives Matter, we've seen that, maybe we've been part of it, despite the pandemic, made me nervous when they all got in the street, despite the pandemic. But on the other hand, it was, it did get a lot of attention. Has it made a difference? Can't see it yet. We don't know. Snowden got a lot of attention. Did it actually affect surveillance? Not as far as I'm aware. Chelsea Manning reveals torture, reveals death squads, reveals far more civilians killed, spends 7.5 years in prison, Snowden, permanent exile. Can you say it made a difference? Very hard to say. So when I encourage people to be whistleblowers, it has to be with I've never said that there was any guarantee of having an effect, but 50 years after my revelation, I have to say over those 50 years, the chance that it will actually have an effect is even lower than I thought 50 years ago. That's the bad experience. Is it zero? No. At least we can't say that it's sure to be zero. That's what I'm working on here. The future is more uncertain than one can confidently say this or that will make any difference. Truth-telling, movement, whatever. Yes, we do need a movement to affect Congress, and they could change this stuff very definitely. And there is support for it in Congress, just a minority. and it's always been a minority. So we have to understand that what we have to do is somehow change the incentives of the people in Congress whose campaign donations and reelection and position in Congress depends on their doing what the military-industrial complex wants. We have a specific opponent. It's not just that people are all asleep and they haven't noticed what needs to be done. We have an active, organized, very rich set of corporations who profit by the existing status quo and will oppose any change of it. And we can give, there are names of these people, which most people don't know. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and let's see, I left out somebody. Lockheed Martin, there's 5.
Grumman.
Who did I leave out? Northrop Grumman, General
Grumman.
Dynamics. What?
Grumman.
I'm sorry?
Is Grumman in there?
Raytheon. Okay,
Raytheon.
we've got 5. Now, they get an enormous amount of the defense money here on this. Well, look at behind me here. I have a library of books on arms control, on nuclear dangers, on everything else. You probably have some comparable number of books. Not as many as I suspect, because I've been at this for collecting them for 60 years. Look at the index of the book for the words Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, not there. It's like discussing the climate problem without using the name Exxon. And that's what the climate movement does. They will say, Bill McKibben, whom I admire unreservedly, marvelously, look for the name Exxon in his writing. I don't find it. So you're going at this as though you're in a political campaign where you're not mentioning that, where you don't seem to know that you have an opposition. We do have an opposition. Okay, so we need a movement that will somehow counter the movement or cabal or conspiracy or whatever you want to call it, ruling class interest that we're actually trying to oppose. And I think we need to change that. That's one thing my Nation article, which is mainly written by Norman Solomon, will come out tomorrow in the Nation. I urge them just to sign it by Norman Solomon, but the Nation wants to have my name on it, get more people to read it. So, and I certainly agree with everything in it. And it makes the point that, this point that I've just been making. We need to get rid of the ICBMs. That doesn't solve the problem, but it makes a very big difference. Nothing else can make such a big difference. And without that, little that has been done in the arms control field for 50 years has made much difference in the risk of the war. Because the ICBMs are still there as temptations to launch on warning, on false tactical warning. You could increase the number of warheads altogether and get rid of the ICBMs for a net increase in warheads and make the world much safer. But without getting rid of them, we have a hair trigger to a doomsday machine. Well, okay, I've gone on and on one subject. Yes, Helen?
We have a question from Helen. Yes, please. Yeah. You need to unmute your mic, Helen. We can't hear you.
She's not talking yet.
Yeah. No, she was. We still can't hear you, Helen.
Okay, now I'm muted. Okay. My name is Helen Young. I'm a filmmaker and journalist. And Dan, I had the great honor of interviewing you for my documentary about the nuns, the priests, and the bombs. I don't know if you remember that, but
oh, great.
I have 2 follow-up questions. One, I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on what happened during the time when Trump was flying to Florida. You said that he didn't have access to the football. And number 2, how do you counter the fact that the Chinese now are building silos for ICBMs? I mean, if you listen to any of the congressional hearings and you hear from the defense people, they're talking about China and the fact that they're arming up now with their own ICBMs. So please talk about that. Thank you.
Okay. First, the US is not the only part of the problem. Other countries, the other nuclear states, especially Russia, are part of the problem. And China. Now, although China has until now been the least part of the problem, if there is something as a sane nuclear policy, if there is such a thing, and one could say there was, the Chinese have exemplified it from 1964 till the last few years, when they have been modernizing. Now, do they need, by reasonable standards, is it essential for them to, quote, modernize or to add to their missiles? I would say no. But they are facing, no, they don't need to do this. And I'm sure, by the way, there are Chinese who understand that. That country has shown more understanding of the nuclear problem than any other for the last half century. So there must be people who oppose what's happening now. But there's several dimensions here. They have altogether about 300 warheads, most of which are on tactical nuclear warheads, short range for Russia and for offshore islands. I still think they have, I'd have to check on this, but I think only a couple dozen that can reach the United States. Is that enough to give them deterrence? I would say yes, in general terms, as much as they can get from 1,000. I mean, comparable to what they can get to 1,000. However, they do see a country that is investing, the US, that is investing in counter-force attacks on their missiles, many of which are mobile, hard to get. But the land-based ones, yes, you can get. No assurance that you'll get them all. We are developing conventionally armed cruise missiles in the area that are so accurate, they can themselves destroy a silo-based ICBM. And we are investing in those. Why are we doing that? If not to target their land-based missiles. How much deterrence, how much threat to an attacking power do they need to deter, quote, a rational opponent of the kind that can be deterred? Well, it would seem what they've had all these years, they always thought was adequate, and probably so. Nevertheless, looking at Trump specifically, and earlier ones, the pivot to China and so forth that Obama talked about, they do have to say, well, maybe it's not deterring them, maybe it takes more. So to speak the language of the Pentagon, sort of look through their eyes, they feel that they need more missiles to deter. Are they acquiring the kind of disarming first strike capability that the US and Russia have? And how is that measured? Neither side can assure itself of destroying all the other side's submarines, of which the Chinese have some too. But in terms of getting the other side's land-based missiles and command and control, US and Russia have invested in enormous amounts of money to get rid of that part of the other side's capability, to disarm them of what they can be disarmed of. China has never sought to do that. Neither have any of the other powers. None of them have a disarming capability against the US or Russia or even their local opponents. They haven't gone for it. It is basically infeasible. But you can pretend you have it and you can appear to believe that you have it, and that does make you more dangerous. We're hearing that they may increase from some 300 warheads to 600. Well, can that disarm us? No. That would still leave them with 600, 10%. Bad on arithmetic here. It's the only trait I share in common with Edward Teller. But it's like 5%. Let's say, okay, we each have about 3,000. So 300 is 10%. They're increasing with 600. They would have, 20% of what we have. Okay, what difference does that make? Well, no difference, but it can make a little deterrence. a little more deterrence. That seems to be what they are going for, greater deterrence of our attack on them. To pretend that increases the chance of a Chinese attack on us is ridiculous. It increases it from 0 to 0. Totally suicidal. Nevertheless, the image of their building stuff is used by our Congress, however crazily, as saying, look, they're building up, we have to build up. They are building up from a sane minimum deterrent to a slightly larger minimum deterrence, or twice as large, but it's still very small. They already have the ability to destroy life on Earth. If they used all of their 300 warheads on cities, on their cities, including cities near them, doesn't have to be in the US, they would cause a nuclear winter. They are a nuclear winter power already. Other states are on the edge of it. With 100 to 200 warheads, they could probably, like India and Pakistan, starve 1 to 2 billion people, but possibly not 7 billion. Or maybe they could do 7 billion. So anyway, what I'm saying is, it is very hard to get Congress that wants any excuse to keep earning the campaign contributions that they have been getting all these years. Any excuse to keep the subsidy going will be seized on, and is being seized on by Congress. That's another reason we need more of these missiles. It makes no sense strategically, militarily anyway, but that's what they're doing. So that's the a long answer. Does that answer your question or not? Can't hear you.
You're on mute, Helen.
Say, I didn't hear it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Helen, can you unmute?
Yeah. Did you have any other? Did I not answer part of that? Can't hear you.
I can't hear you, Helen. No.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Now
I
we can.
tried
Now
to,
we
I
can.
tried to unmute. Yes, if you could just follow up on the on what happened during the. You talked about the number of people who do have access to the launch codes, and also the fact that you said when Trump was on Inauguration Day, he did not have the football with him. My understanding was that he did have it with him, and then it was transferred to Biden. Is that not true?
No, okay. Let me clarify that. There is a content to the football. By the way, I just saw yesterday a reason why they call it football, and I've forgotten it already at 90. I saw yesterday why it has something to do with a game context in general. Darn, I forgot. Anyway, it's always called the football for no obvious reason. And without that, the president would not be one of those who could launch the missiles. There are lots of people who can launch the missiles. The president is one of them. Without that football, he would not be one of them. So it goes, actually, they've gone through a little charade for 50 years now as follows. On Inauguration Day until now, you've always had two presidents, the incumbent and the incoming president. And they actually go through a thing that gets, by some people, mentioned in the press, and that's why they do it, where the person who controls, the control officer who has that briefcase, changes his gaze from the recent incumbent president to the new one at the moment of the thing. All of which is to convey, don't worry, it's all in civilian hands, it's all in safe hands. Only one person can do this at a time. False. Kind of obviously false. It kind of has to be false. You can't have a situation where Hinckley can paralyze our defense system, in a certain sense. By the way, supposing it did paralyze it, what difference would that make exactly? We're not supposed to push the button. You shouldn't push it under any circumstances, whatever. But our deterrence has always depended on the possibility, which is more than zero, that we will do something crazy, evil, insane, unnecessary, if attacked. Is that highly unlikely? No, it's not highly unlikely. But if you didn't have the missiles, if you didn't have the button or anything, you couldn't pretend to do that. As I say, unfortunately, it's more than a pretense. It's not hard to get people to plan, ready themselves to do something, an act of revenge, in effect, that is suicidal in response to a humiliating attack on oneself. That's human. It's what humans do. So it's not hard to make that predictable. And the more money you spent to prepare for that, the more it looks as though you actually believe it, crazy as it is. So what was attributed to Nixon, a madman strategy? I'll convince the North Vietnamese that I'm crazy enough to use nuclear weapons. That was his strategy. He was going to win on. That didn't start with Nixon, and it didn't end with Nixon. It has been the essence of our strategy since we had nuclear weapons. Now, initially, we had a monopoly, so the craziness did not consist of a suicidal aspect of it, except for the nuclear winter part that we didn't know about. Truman starts out in 46 with about 3 nuclear atomic weapons. In 45, we used one for Trinity, a test, one on Nagasaki, one on Hiroshima. We had, at the end of 45, 1 or 2 assembled weapons. That was our arsenal. In 46, we had a few more, a handful more, 47 and so forth. When he left office, he had 1,000 atomic weapons scheduled. Now, for what? What did you need 1,000 weapons for? For any reason. You're not going to destroy yourself with them, except you would, because they were targeted on cities. We didn't know that. Surprise, oops, we use them, we shouldn't get anything in response, and we don't. Only harvests worldwide are destroyed by 70% of the sunlight being set by our city target bombing, follow? So a year later, we'd find, oh, surprise, we just killed ourselves along with everybody else. But suppose you didn't know about that, you could still say, why 1,000 weapons? Well, it was under LeMay, chairman, the head of the Strategic Air Command, and he had learned in the last part of World War II that the way you win wars is by killing people. And as he said to my friend Sam Cohen, Sam, in war is killing people. When you kill enough, the other guy quits. You couldn't kill too many. So he wanted the nuclear weapon to go into, which it did, into assembly line production. Before that, it had been a craft production, handmade, essentially, one weapon at a time. Then you got an assembly line production in around 48, 49. So he had 1,000. Gives you nuclear winter, but we didn't know that. But without nuclear winter, it's killing, atomic weapons, many, many millions of people. Why? Well, that's the way you fight wars, LeMay had learned. Eisenhower comes into office then with 1,000 weapons. When he leaves, there are 23,000 weapons, mostly thermonuclear, most of which were 1,000 times as large as the Nagasaki weapon, 1,000 times, 23,000 weapons. Eventually, we had 37,000 nuclear weapons. The Russians had about, at that time, around 35,000. It was about a little over 70,000 weapons on the world. Okay. It's as insane as anything could be. What could be more insane? And yet, that's where we were.
Dan, I just really want to follow up with one thing. As you know, there are bills in Congress. I think Senator Markey and Congressman Liu, they're sponsoring legislation to change this sole authority by the president. And essentially what you're saying is that, he doesn't have sole authority, that there's a whole range of people who have the authority to launch nuclear weapons, which flies.
By the way, you put your finger, Helen, on something that I only thought of it once fleetingly, and I've never seen anybody else say it. at the most, you're trying to get a 2-man rule or a 3-man rule at the presidential level. But how about at every other level? Who's going to decide if the president is out of it? Everywhere else should have such a thing, but they don't. It's only going to be the president. But anyway, I say I feel strongly, not being a constitutional lawyer by any means. I'm a defendant. I'm not a lawyer, but it's my strong belief that this is again kind of a facade or charade they're going through. You can't limit the president's ability as commander-in-chief to order an attack. I just think constitutionally, there's no way to put anybody else in that line. And that's what they're going to find out. So you can go through the motions of saying this is a bad situation, which it clearly is. The real part is you would like to say that no one can fire a nuclear weapon unless there is, unequivocal evidence that we have experienced a nuclear, unless we've been under attack. You can't fire it at all until that. Well, let's see. Well, but we want to be able to fire first to forestall their weapons to some extent. The answer to that is you can't limit the damage from Russia or to some extent from China, but it's too much. You could, in theory, limit damage in an attack from North Korea to some extent. Russia, no. The second thing is that the point is that the president is in charge. You can't keep him from doing it, really. You can mutiny, and that's what they're calling for. In effect, that's what Milley was saying. He doesn't want to come right out and say, I would disobey that order, because he has to resign right then if he's saying that. There's some circumstances I would disobey. You can't be a military officer and say that, but you can think it. In effect, that's what we're counting on. He says there are other people involved. Yes, but not one of them has the constitutional authority to stop it. As humans, they can question it. And strictly speaking, they can kind of slow walk it, but if the president insists, then either you do it or you get fired. And you can fire him. There's no process for firing. You just say you're fired. And the next guy in the room, he can name anybody, the secretary. But you get somebody else. And as we saw with the Saturday Night Massacre, President says to Elliot Richardson, fire Alexander Cox. Richardson says, in effect, I can't, I won't, you're fired. Ruckelshaus comes in instantly, you do it, I can't, you're fired. Then Bork comes in and says, okay, I'll do it. So you find somebody who'll do it. Or you just mutiny, you almost physically have to restrain the president.
Wow. Marty.
Yes,
Marty
Dan, I'm so happy to see that you're here. Thanks so much for coming. What I did want to ask you, though, is do you think the declaration of no first use might be the most effective first step in attempting to slow down this arms race and perhaps terminate it? Do you think that's the
that's a matter of judgment, and there's reasonable disagreement on things. Generally, I would say that simply declaring no first use is very useful. It has some immediate consequences that are complicating, but it is very good. It would imply a whole change in our alliance system and our whole structure of nuclear policy. So it's not something you can think of as an easy, simple, one-step thing. It's a very consequential thing. However, with no change in posture, it's hard to believe that it has much effect at all. Everybody else can, and by experience, will say, that's just words. As Greta would put it, blah, blah, blah. And when the Russians did announce no first use, our Pentagon lost no time in saying, bah, means nothing. And to some extent that was true. I don't know this, and I haven't even seen much comment on it, but I did read somewhere, based on what, that the Russians didn't mean much by it. It didn't affect any of their planning, one way or the other. They said it, but it didn't affect their planning. What would affect planning? Changing the missiles aimed at East Germany, for example, getting rid of them. I would say that a combination of no first use, which has diplomatic consequences, a combination of that and getting rid of ICBMs is a concrete evidence that will have an effect on people's minds and actions. It shows we're prepared to take action away from first use. Here's one way to think of it. What if you said, we don't have first use, we're not going to do first use, and we are getting rid of weapons that have no other use than first use? What is that? ICBMs. They have no use other than first use. Keep them on the ground, they're destroyed. They're very vulnerable. So in second use, of course, well, let me take that back. I'd have to define it differently, because of course, the Russians could use nuclear weapons in Europe. That would be first use. And then we promised to respond with ICBMs. So I have to rephrase that. You can't just say they have no weapon other than first use. I'll think about it. Okay. But anyway, they are for first use, essentially. And I'll get rid of them. And it shows that you are divesting yourself. You're going the other direction. You are not increasing your ability to go first, you're decreasing them. Now, that in itself, even without words, might have some effect on our alliances. The appearance that we will blow the world up if we don't like what the Russians are doing has an effect. You're just going to make, obviously, you tread a little more carefully in a room with a crazy person, just as they were concerned about Trump. So the crazier we look, the more plausible it is that we will be crazy enough to follow up our threats by actually pushing a button that destroys everything. If you move away from that, you look less crazy. Does that affect deterrence of non-nuclear attack? Yes. To make that credible, you have to look crazy. If you look less crazy, as though you're really reflecting and you're doing what makes sense, then it looks less likely that you will blow the world up. So in theory, that will have, you'll have some effect. Are those advantages of looking crazy and thereby keeping the other people on their toes and worried and are they worth the actual risk, which is a non-zero risk of blowing the world up? I would say absolutely not. But that requires, knowing what the situation is. The American Congress and SAC and President and public have acted for 70 years as though they were okay with that, except for people in the freeze movement, except for the activists, who are a very small number. But I didn't mention this on the freeze movement. One of the great disheartening events in my life. I wake up on election day, 1984, a day or two after, having known that 87% of the public were for the freeze. The president is against it. Reagan wins a landslide. What the hell is that? So I took a little arithmetic and I said, well, as best I can figure, that means as many as half of our freeze people who supported the freeze must have voted for Reagan. Meaning, at best, it's just not that high in their priorities. It's not what they vote on. They vote on other things. Yes, they would like to see a freeze, but not enough to vote for Mondale or who was it? I don't forget who it was in that election. And not enough to vote against Reagan. So that was very disheartening. I was actually distinctly depressed, and I mean not just saddened. I was depressed for months after that election. That meant that for years I've been going on the assumption we had the people on our side on this issue. But the way they voted on, Noam, my friend Noam, is always saying, look, in polls, the people are with us, on a variety of subjects, minimum wage, health, almost anything you can name. The people on polls, but that doesn't mean they vote on those issues. And that's disheartening. But it means to me, this, I've often said, and it's not a joke, this is not a species to be trusted with nuclear weapons. Well, unfortunately, to paraphrase Rumsfeld, I guess, you go to war or peace with the species you have, not with the species. And I'm afraid that's why probably we will not solve the nuclear problem until it blows up. Probably we will not stop climate rise short of 3-4 degrees, not 1.5 and not 2 either. Probably. So nevertheless, the straits are such that I would say with anything more than 0, and it is more than 0, when you allow for miracles that you don't foresee, is it worth a person's life to try to change the odds here? It seems obviously yes. And people who tell themselves, well, it's 0 that I can have any effect on this, that's not an unreasonable estimate, but it's wrong. Nobody knows that much. It's not a reasonable basis for saying, well, I could even say there's a reasonable basis, but it's not a confident basis for saying it cannot be done. It's too early. We're on the Titanic at full speed on a dark night in iceberg waters. Have we actually hit the iceberg yet? And that's the three. On climate, we may have. We might look back on that and said, oh, the decisions were taken a while ago. There wasn't any chance of changing that. On political grounds, you could always look back and say, politically speaking, this wasn't going to happen. You don't really, but until you hit the iceberg, you don't really know.
Wow, that's I mean, I go back again to Gramsci. We have to think pessimistically, but act optimistically.
Yeah. But you don't even have to be pessimistic. It's kind of realistic,
Realistic.
He did say pessimistic. Yeah. But.
Yeah, but critical thinking, facing the reality as you've helped us do, but at the same time, not being resigned, but saying we have to act. And
but there is another way of talking. I don't know whether it's more than rhetoric or not, but a guy, for instance, that I follow, who's very eloquent, very good, named Robert Keeler, Koehler. He's very good, but he says in one way or another often, I know that humanity has what it takes to get out of this. And I think when I read that and I put a margin, I don't exactly know that, to say that it's a human problem and therefore we can solve it, that doesn't follow. That's wrong reasoning. We can certainly produce problems that we can't solve. I mean, very, very obvious when you step off a cliff, the fact that you did that as a human doesn't mean you can keep yourself from crashing at the bottom. I just thought of that actually. But yeah, we can, because when you say we can do it, I can name steps that, are the kind of thing that have been done in the past and in theory could be done. But can we actually challenge the political influence of Exxon and Boeing on this? Can we? Afterwards, it's possible to say afterwards that there really was not possible somehow. But beforehand, it doesn't follow that we have the ability. We're not seeing the ability to do it as political creatures in large numbers in cities and with a hierarchy and patriarchy. So we'll see. So I'm betting on the possibility. As I've said, I choose to act. It's a choice. by the way, you often hear from whistleblowers, I just heard it the other day from somebody, I had no choice. I couldn't have done otherwise. So, well, that's, people may feel that way, but that's never the way I feel. I also, of course, I have a choice like everybody else to be silent about this. But I choose to act as if it might make a difference. And in the case of the Pentagon Papers, it made no difference on Nixon's policy. And the next year, in 72, we were in the heaviest bombing of the war. And it appeared to me that it had made no difference, and it hadn't made any difference up till then. But he had taken crimes in response to his fear that I had material on him that actually very unforeseeably and unlikely brought him down, and that made the war endable. So my case with Patricia, Tony Russo, all the people involved, we definitely were part of a chain of events that were necessary to ending that war, necessary. 50 people, 100 people, maybe more. But, you know, that's still a small number considering. But we were necessary. If Butterfield had not revealed the taping, Nixon stays in office and the war continues. And I could say many other things. I mentioned Richardson, Ruckelshaus. Richardson resigns, but Ruckelshaus accepts, like work. People don't notice, people resign, people get fired, but 2 people getting fired in the same night, people woke up on that one. And they got what Haig called a firestorm of protest. Take Milley, or, you know, in this case, we've seen with Trump, various people saying that they actually did confront Trump with resigning. I think his counsel, was his name Gahn, G-A-H-N or Graham or something like that. One of his legal counsel said, no, I'll resign if you fire so-and-so. I've forgotten at this moment. But if 2 people do that or 3 people do that, McNamara said afterwards, if I had resigned, it's a one-day story. Well, that's silly. I mean, of course, it would be more than a one-day story, but would it be enough to make a difference? Not necessarily. But if he had resigned, with a drawer full of documents, hard to keep it going with that. If 2 of them had resigned, and I'll mention people who wanted out of there as early as 64 and 65, the Vice President, Hubert Humphrey, my boss, John McNaughton, Assistant Secretary, Ball, number 3, I forget, 2 or 3 men in the State Department. McGeorge Bundy had real doubts. Bill Bundy had more than doubts. Bill Bundy really on this side. The head of intelligence and research, Tom Hughes, they all believed, hopeless, get out, shouldn't do this. They were each told, don't share that belief with anybody. Ball, I've talked to the people who drafted their memos. Ball and Humphrey were saying almost exactly the same thing, and neither of their aides knew that the other was doing it, because they were ordered by the president, don't show this to anybody else. Don't let anybody be aware that there is more than one person, or even as many as one person, who believes, you know, that this is the wrong thing to do. Clifford, I forgot to mention. And those are very big people, even Atchison at that point. If 2 or 3 of them had gone to the president with the clear implication we're prepared to go public, that I think could have avoided the war. Even little me, with what I had in my safe, my name is totally unknown, but if I had released the documents in my safe, I do not believe that the war could have continued in 64. Once you've got it started, it's a lot harder to stop it. But the inability, and this we see in history over the last millennia, once it's started, once people have died, then the need to justify that you've killed people unnecessarily, wrongly, that admission will be avoided at the cost of any number of further lives. There's just no limit. And when I say no limit, I'm talking about nuclear war. They will they'll go up to the level of nuclear war to avoid admitting that they have, quote, wasted earlier lives, which is true. They wrongly ordered them over the cliff to no effect.
Wow. I think that's an extraordinary place to end.
I'm happy to go on, but it doesn't matter. I know we had a dramatic ending there, but